I want to tell you about the night I sat in my car in the driveway of the house I had lived in for 11 years and could not make myself go inside. Not because I was afraid of what I would find. I already knew what I would find. I knew because I had spent the previous 6 weeks finding out everything methodically and completely in the specific way that a man who has decided to know the truth before he does anything else goes about knowing it. I sat in that driveway for 22 minutes. I know it was 22 minutes because I watched the clock on the dashboard the entire time. And then I went inside, and I said her name. And when she looked up from the couch, I understood from the way she looked at me that she had been waiting for this moment and had not known when it was going to arrive and had been carrying the weight of that uncertainty for longer than I had been carrying the weight of what I knew. My name is not important. You can call me Owen. I was 41 years old, a high school chemistry teacher, and I had been married to a woman named Rachel for 11 years. This is the complete story of what happened. Every detail, nothing softened. Rachel and I met when I was 28 and she was 26. We were introduced by a mutual friend at a gathering that neither of us had particularly wanted to attend, and that we both left earlier than planned, together to go to a diner down the street where we sat for 3 hours and talked about everything and nothing in the way that you only do with someone when the conversation has a quality you have not encountered before and that you are not willing to end. She was a nurse, methodical and warm, and possessed of the specific emotional intelligence that her profession required and that she carried into every other part of her life. I was in my second year of teaching, still learning the gap between knowing a subject and being able to transfer it to 30 teenagers who had not yet decided whether they cared about it. We understood each other's work in the way that two people do when they have both chosen professions that require patience and genuine investment in other people's development. We got married after 3 years of dating. We bought a house in year 2 of the marriage, a 4-bedroom in a neighborhood where I could walk to school and where Rachel's hospital was a 12-minute drive. We had 2 sons, Daniel, who was 7, and Noah, who was 5. They were the best thing either of us had ever done, and we both knew it and said it to each other regularly and meant it every time. The marriage had been, for its first 8 years, what I believed a good marriage was. Not without difficulty. We had been through the specific exhaustion of early parenthood, the financial pressure of a mortgage and 2 children and 2 professional salaries that were comfortable but not expansive, the ordinary friction of 2 people who love each other and still sometimes make each other's lives harder, without meaning to. But underneath all of that there had been, for 8 years, a genuine foundation, a real partnership. 2 people who had chosen each other and who continued, in the ways that mattered, to keep choosing each other. What changed in year 9, I did not see at the time because I was not looking. I had no reason to look. The change was not dramatic. It was a gradual cooling, a subtle withdrawal of the specific quality of attention that had defined the best years of us. I told myself it was stress. Her unit at the hospital had been understaffed for months. My teaching load had increased. We were both tired in ways that 2 working parents of young children are tired. I told myself the distance was circumstantial and temporary. I was wrong about temporary. His name was Patrick. He was a physician at Rachel's hospital, 43 years old, recently separated from his own wife at the time they met. Or so Rachel would tell me later. Much later, after the full truth had been established and denial was no longer available to either of them. She had met him in year 9 of our marriage. They had worked together on the same unit for 2 years before anything happened. What happened when it happened was not, from Rachel's account, a sudden thing. It was a gradual one. Conversations after shifts. A shared sensibility about the work. The specific intimacy that develops between 2 people who have seen difficult things together and who have learned to trust each other's professional judgment in high-stakes situations. I understand all of that. I do not say it to excuse what came next. I say it because I think the honest version of a story about an affair includes the part where you understand how it started, even when the understanding is painful, because understanding is different from forgiving and both are different from accepting. The affair had been running for 14 months when I found the first indication of it. The indication was not dramatic. It was a phone bill the same quiet, ordinary domestic detail that has unraveled more lives than any dramatic revelation ever could. I was going through the monthly household accounts on a Sunday afternoon in January, a habit I had maintained since the early years of the mortgage, and I noticed a number that appeared in the call log with a frequency that was inconsistent with the category of professional contact. Not every day, not even every week, but regularly and at hours, early morning, late evening, that did not suggest a professional relationship. I noted the number. I did not call it. I did not mention it to Rachel. I went back to the accounts and finished what I'd been doing, and then I sat for a while with the specific feeling of a man who has seen a data point that he cannot yet interpret and who knows from experience that interpreting it prematurely produces bad conclusions. I wrote the number on a piece of paper. I put the piece of paper in the back of a notebook in my desk drawer. I want to make dinner. Noah helped me set the table. Daniel told me about something that had happened at school. I listened. I was fully present. I did not think about the number again until the boys were asleep. When the boys were asleep, I went to my desk and I looked at the number on the piece of paper. I searched it. It was a personal mobile number registered to a Patrick Hale at an address in our city. I searched the name. He was a physician. He worked at Rachel's hospital. His professional profile photograph showed a man who was, objectively, confident and well-presented in the way of someone who had learned early that his appearance was an asset and had maintained it as such. I sat with that photograph on my screen for a moment. Then I closed the laptop. I went to bed. Rachel was already asleep. I lay in the dark, and I thought about the frequency of the calls and the hours and the name and the photograph and the 14 months of gradual cooling that I had been attributing to circumstance and exhaustion. And I thought about my boys sleeping down the hall and about the house and about 11 years. And I made a decision that I want to tell you about precisely because I think it is the decision that determined everything that followed. I decided that I was not going to act on incomplete information. I was going to find out the complete truth, and then I was going to decide what to do with it. Finding out the complete truth took 6 weeks. I want to walk you through those 6 weeks because the how of it matters as much as the what. The first thing I did was call my brother Thomas, who was a family attorney. I called him from my car during my lunch break on a Monday, and I told him what I had found. He asked 3 questions. Then he said, "Owen, before you do anything else, you need to speak to a divorce attorney. Not because the divorce is certain, but because you need to understand your legal position and particularly your position regarding the boys before you have any conversation with Rachel." I said, "I know." He gave me a name. I called that name the same afternoon. Her name was Patricia Shun, and she took my call and asked 6 questions and said, "Come in Wednesday." I was there Wednesday morning. She listened to everything, asked 8 more questions, and said, "The children are your primary concern, and your documented role as an active and present parent is your strongest asset in any custody proceeding. Do not change your behavior toward your sons by a single degree throughout this process." I said, "I had no intention of doing so." She said, "I know. I am saying it because it is the most important thing I can say to you right now." Patricia referred me to a forensic accountant named Sandra Okafor and a licensed investigator named Carol Watts. I met with Sandra first. She spent a week going through our shared financial records, looking for any pattern of expenditure that could not be accounted for by documented household or professional expenses. What she found was modest in financial terms, but significant in what it confirmed. Across 11 months, there were 43 transactions on Rachel's personal credit card that did not match any household expense or professional cost. Restaurant charges, 2 hotel stays, a weekend away that Rachel had told me was a nursing conference and that Sandra identified through the booking records as a personal reservation at a boutique hotel in a city 2 hours from ours. The total was $8,200. Not a large amount, not insignificant either. But more than the money, what Sandra's report gave me was a timeline. 11 months of documented expenditure. The phone calls had been running for 14 months. The relationship was at minimum 14 months old and had been conducted with enough consistency and regularity to leave a financial trace across 11 of them. I took the report home and read it in my car in the driveway before going inside. Carol Watts took 3 weeks. I want to be honest about those 3 weeks in the way I've tried to be honest about everything in this story. They were the worst 3 weeks of my adult life. Not because of what I feared Carol would find. I'd already formed a clear picture of what she would find, and I was not wrong about the broad outline of it. They were the worst 3 weeks because I was living inside them. I was waking up next to Rachel every morning. I was having breakfast with my boys. I was driving to school and teaching chemistry and coming home and making dinner and helping with homework and reading bedtime stories and doing every ordinary thing that the life I had built required of me. And underneath all of it, every day for 3 weeks, was the knowledge of what I was waiting for and the discipline of not letting that knowledge change a single visible thing about how I showed up. Daniel asked me once during those 3 weeks if I was okay. He was 7 years old. I said, "I am fine, bud." He said, "You seem quiet." I said, "Just tired from work." He nodded and went back to his drawing. I sat at the kitchen table and I held myself together and I thought, this is what I am protecting. This ordinary moment. This boy at this table. I will not let anything I do in the next 3 weeks damage this. Carol's report arrived on a Thursday. Patricia called me the same afternoon. She said, "The report is thorough. Come in tomorrow morning." I went in Friday. I read the report at Patricia's conference table. It documented the following. 14 confirmed meetings between Rachel and Patrick across a 12-week observation window. The meetings had taken place at his apartment on 9 occasions, at a hotel on 3 occasions, and at 2 restaurants. The pattern was consistent, regular, and showed no signs of having concluded or diminished in frequency. Patrick's separation from his wife, which Rachel had apparently described to me as the context in which they had grown closer, had been finalized 4 months into their relationship, meaning they had begun while he was still married. The report included a timeline that cross-referenced with our own records, established that the relationship had been active during our last family vacation, during Daniel's birthday, during Noah's first week of school, during every significant family event of the past 14 months. I read the last page. I closed the report. I looked at Patricia. I said, "What do I do now?" She said, "Now you decide." I sat in Patricia's office for a long time after I said that. She did not rush me. She was the kind of attorney who understood that the legal question and the human question were not the same question, and that the human question had to be answered first. I thought about Rachel, not the Rachel of the past 14 months. The Rachel who had been conducting this carefully and consistently enough to leave the kind of paper trail that required a forensic accountant and a licensed investigator to fully document. I thought about the Rachel of the 11 years before that. The woman I had met at a gathering neither of us had wanted to attend. The woman who had sat with me for 3 hours in a diner and talked about everything and nothing. The woman who had held my hand through the specific terror of becoming a parent for the first time, and who had known, in the moments when I was unsure, exactly what to say. I thought about whether those 11 years and that Rachel and this Rachel were reconcilable into a single person I could choose to continue building a life with. I sat with that question for a long time. Then I looked at Patricia and I said, "I want to end the marriage. But I want to do it in a way that puts my boys first in every decision from this point forward." She said, "Then let us build that." I told Rachel on a Sunday evening after the boys were in bed. I had planned to wait until Monday when they were at school, but Sunday evening arrived and the specific weight of another night of knowing, without saying, became something I could not carry past that day. I sat across from her at the kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had sat drawing during those 3 weeks, the same table where we had eaten 11 years of dinners, and I said her name. She looked up, and then I said, "I know about Patrick." The expression that moved across her face in the moment after I said his name was one I had never seen before and that I have thought about many times since. It was not surprise. It was not fear exactly. It was something closer to a very specific kind of exhaustion, the exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a secret for a long time and has just been released from the weight of it. She said, "How long have you known?" I said, 6 weeks. She said, 6 weeks. She said it the way you repeat something when you're processing what it means. Then she said, "I am so sorry, Owen." I said, "I know." She said, "I did not want it to happen this way." I said, "Nobody ever does." And then I told her I was filing for divorce. Rachel did not argue. She did not deny. She did not try to negotiate a path through the marriage that I had already decided was finished. She cried, which I expected, and I sat across the table and I watched her cry, and I felt something that I find hard to name even now. Not cold, not distant, but something like the specific sadness of a man who still loves the person across from him and understands that loving someone and being able to continue building a life with them are not the same thing. We talked for 2 hours, not about the affair and its details. I had the details. I did not need her account of them. We talked about the boys, about how we were going to tell them, when in what words, about what the next weeks needed to look like for their stability, about what kind of parents we were going to be to them now that we were going to stop being partners to each other. That conversation was the most painful and most important one I have ever had. And it was also, in its own strange way, the most honest conversation Rachel and I had had in at least 2 years, which told me something about the marriage that I had already known but had not been able to look at directly until that night. Rachel retained a divorce attorney within a week. I had told her about Patricia without telling her why I had retained her 6 weeks earlier. I said simply that I had sought legal advice in preparation for this conversation and that I thought we should both have representation. Rachel said she understood. Her attorney was competent and professional, and their opening position on custody was, Patricia noted, reasonable in its structure. Week on, week off, shared decision-making on the boys' education and medical care, flexibility around school events and holidays. Patricia's response acknowledged the reasonableness of the custody framework and proposed 2 modifications that I had been specific about. The first was that primary residence for both boys during the school week would be with me. Given that my school schedule aligned with theirs, and given the documented continuity of my caregiver role, school records, medical appointment records, extracurricular enrollment, all of it established that I had been the primary weekday parent for both boys throughout their lives. The second was a financial settlement that reflected Sandra's documented expenditure findings and sought contribution from Rachel for the $8,200 in marital assets used to fund the parallel relationship. Rachel's attorney pushed back on the primary residence proposal. That was the piece of the negotiation that took the longest and cost me the most in terms of the sustained patience it required. I want to be honest about that. The financial piece resolved relatively quickly. Rachel did not contest Sandra's documentation, and the contribution was agreed upon in the second week of negotiations. The custody piece took 6 weeks. Not because Rachel was unwilling to be reasonable about the boys' welfare, but because she was their mother and she loved them, and the prospect of not having them with her during the school week was a genuine loss that she was not able to accept without working through it fully. I understood that. I did not make it easier than it needed to be, but I did not make it harder. Patricia negotiated with a precision and a steadiness that I found, across those 6 weeks, genuinely remarkable. She never lost sight of what mattered most. She never allowed the process to become adversarial in a way that would damage the co-parenting relationship that Rachel and I were going to need to maintain for the next decade. At the end of 6 weeks, the custody arrangement was primary residence with me during the school week, Rachel with the boys every Wednesday evening, and every other full weekend, shared decision-making on all significant matters, and a flexibility clause that allowed adjustment as the boys grew and their needs changed. The financial settlement was finalized on a Thursday afternoon. The house went to me. Rachel agreed to this because the boys' school was 3 blocks away and because disrupting their physical home on top of everything else was something neither of us was willing to do to them. Rachel took her retirement account and a share of the liquid savings. The $8,200 contribution was incorporated into the settlement as a credit against her share. Patricia called me after the signing and said, "The boys are going to be all right. You have made every decision in this process with them first. That will matter more than anything else over the next few years." I said, "I know." She said, "Call me if you need anything." I said, "Thank you." I drove home. Daniel and Noah were at my mother's for the afternoon. I walked into the house, and I stood in the kitchen, and I looked at the table, and I thought about 11 years. About the diner. About 3 hours of conversation. About 2 boys sleeping down the hall. About the ways that things end, and the ways that what you build with someone does not entirely end even when the partnership that built it does. Patrick, I have not mentioned him since Chunk 4, and I want to address him directly because I think he deserves honesty in this story the same way everyone else does. I did not contact him. I made that decision early, and I held it. My issue was with Rachel and with the choices she had made inside our marriage. Patrick had been involved in something that damaged my life significantly, but he had not taken my money, had not violated my legal rights, had not done anything that gave me a legitimate basis for direct engagement beyond the personal. I was also aware, from what Rachel had eventually told me during our kitchen table conversation, that his own marriage had ended during the period of their relationship. He had his own damage to account for. I was not interested in adding to it or in inserting myself into a situation that was already complicated enough without my participation. I thought about him occasionally in the months that followed, not with anger primarily, with something closer to a recognition that the specific kind of pain his situation involved was not entirely different from mine, and that pain of that quality does not benefit from being compounded by other people's interventions. I want to tell you about the boys because they're the most important part of this story, and because I've been building toward them throughout every other part of it. Daniel was 7 when Rachel and I separated, and is now 9. Noah was 5 and is now 7. They handled it in the ways that their ages and their personalities determined they would handle it. Daniel, who has always been thoughtful and observational in a way that sometimes makes me feel like I am looking at a small version of a quality I recognize in myself, asked questions, careful ones, specific ones, the kind that told me he was trying to build an accurate picture of what had happened and what it meant for his life going forward. I answered every question he asked as honestly as I could at the level of detail that was appropriate for his age. I did not lie to him. I did not tell him more than he needed to know. Noah was less verbal about it and more physical. He wanted to be held more for a period of about 3 months, wanted me in his room for longer at bedtime, wanted the specific reassurance of proximity rather than explanation. I gave him every minute of it without reservation. Both boys are, 2 years on, doing well in the specific ways that matter most. They are secure. They are loved. They know it. Rachel and I have found a way to be, if not friends, then something that functions adequately for 2 people who are raising children together and who need to be in each other's lives without being in each other's lives in the way they once were. We are civil. We are cooperative on the boys' behalf. We have had 2 difficult conversations since the divorce was finalized, one about a school decision and one about a medical one, and we navigated both without the difficulty becoming permanent damage. I think about the person she was for the 8 years before year 9 sometimes. I think about whether that person and the person she became in year 9 are reconcilable into a single coherent understanding of who Rachel is. I do not have a fully satisfying answer. I think the honest answer is that people contain more contradiction than we want them to, and that loving someone does not make you immune to their contradictions, and that understanding their contradictions does not obligate you to remain inside them. I love Rachel. I left the marriage. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and I have stopped trying to resolve the tension between them because I do not think the tension resolves. I think you simply learn to carry it at a weight that does not prevent you from moving forward. I am 43 years old now. I still teach chemistry at the same school. I walk there on most mornings when the weather permits, and the 12-minute walk has become something I protect in my daily schedule because it is the specific, kind of uninterrupted thinking time that the rest of the day rarely provides. The house is quieter than it was when we were all in it together and louder than it would be without Daniel and Noah, which means it is exactly the right volume for the life I am currently living. I have not repainted any rooms. I have not moved any furniture. I have made one significant change to the house, which is that I converted the formal dining room, a room we use perhaps 6 times a year, into a second workspace where Daniel does his homework at a desk I built with him on a Saturday in March, and where Noah has commandeered the corner for a project involving a large quantity of cardboard and tape whose final form has not yet become clear to either of us. I am not in a relationship. I am not in a hurry about that. I have learned that the absence of urgency is itself a form of self-respect. I am happy, not in the way I was happy at 28 in a diner talking to someone for 3 hours. In a different way, a quieter and more deliberate and more fully chosen way. It is, I think, a better kind. Someone asked me not long ago, a colleague at school who knew a version of the story, what I would say to a man who had just discovered that his wife was having an affair and was trying to figure out what to do with that knowledge. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I said, find out everything before you do anything. All of it. Not because you need the information to decide whether to end the marriage. You may already know the answer to that question. But because you need to know the complete picture to make every decision that follows from that one with clarity rather than with the distortion that incomplete information produces. I said, put your children first in every single decision, not as a principle you aspire to, as the actual operating criterion by which you measure every choice. If the decision serves their stability, make it. If it does not, do not make it regardless of how satisfying it might feel in the moment. I said, be honest. With your attorney. With yourself. With your children at the level of detail that is appropriate for their ages. With your wife, when the time comes, in the conversation that needs to happen. Honesty is not the same as cruelty. You can be completely honest and completely kind simultaneously. It requires more discipline than either one alone. It is worth it. If this story hit you somewhere real, leave a comment. This is Reddit Confessions. Subscribe. New story every single week.